Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying behind after your very sumptuous lunch. We have an interesting forum today to discuss what the movement of capital in a deconstructed world is a hefty topic, and we have on stage five experts to help us travel through this narrative. So without further ado, let's turn to Nicolas Aguzin, Gucho, to people who do know him. Gucho, as CEO of Hong Kong Stock Exchange, you are a tireless salesman of the concept of the free movement of capital. And in fact, you've been trying so hard that you have also taken Hong Kong's iconic taxi service to London and New York very recently. But we currently live in a complicated world, a deconstructed world, as the topic says. In this kind of world, what moves capital still?
Okay. So first of all, let me just say that everything that we're doing is to try to make sure that we continue connecting capital with opportunities. Capital always wants to look for opportunities, and opportunities, are always available for that capital. And so we've been spending a lot of time making sure that that trend that you're seeing towards a deconstructed world or decoupling kind of like slows down a little bit. I mean, it's hard to say that there hasn't been any impact. There has been an impact, but I would say that people are shifting in their wording and in their thought from like decoupling to more like de-risking and finding alternatives, and so there's a ton happening in that area. For example, we've been opening our offices in New York, like you saw, and in London. And part of that purpose is that there's still a lot of people in those areas that want to understand what's happening in this part of the world. They want to take part of what's going on. So some participants may decide to trim their exposure, but if you see the numbers, I mean, 2022 was like still the year of most activity globally, but the rate of change has slowed down. So that has been true no matter what. The second thing is that as we see the world investment flows and all that, you're seeing new corridors that are starting to develop. So let's take, for example, where we are today here in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. They're starting to play a bigger role in the interactions with Asia. And I'll give an example of like the largest 10 sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East, which today manage around $4 trillion. Somewhere between 1% and 2% of that is invested in China. But the interest of increasing that has been, expressed publicly throughout many places. And so we see this corridor between Asia and the Middle East developing very, very quickly. I also see, I'm originally from Argentina, so I see the corridor of like Latin America, Middle East, Asia. That's becoming much more connected.
Right.
And we saw some of the announcements around BRICS banks, for example, of adding new players to that, entity. So while some traditional corridors are starting to either slow down and in some cases reverse a little bit, I still see a lot of activity and flow. And the traditional concept that China is like closing up a lot more, it's something that I don't quite see as we're, based in Hong Kong. We actually see the opposite. I mean, if you look at the last 2 or 3 years, the number of opening up initiatives relating to China, it's just amazing. The fact that now international companies that come and list in Hong Kong, that can be invested by domestic investors.
Right.
Because historically it was just like all the world financing Chinese companies. That's what it was in Hong Kong. Now, since March of this year, international companies, for the first time, that come and list there, can leverage that capital from the mainland coming and investing, which is a great thing. So we create those two-way flows, and that's like incredibly important for the future.
Okay, we can address China a little bit later. One thing that struck me about what you said was the fact that capital chases after opportunities. So let's keep that in mind and come back to that later. It's also probably fair to say that most of us have made our careers at a time when the world was a closer place. It was globalization was the buzzword, globalization was the irreversible trend. But now we have fallen into a different, we find ourselves in a different place. We talk about deglobalization, you talk about de-risking. There's somebody coined the word slow globalization as a slowdown of globalization. So all these things are becoming the new normal that we live with. So Karim, I want to turn to you. You are based in Cairo. From your standpoint, there are a lot of issues that affect us, humanity as a whole, such as climate change, as one example. Will these issues, common issues, be affected by this globalization or this deconstructed world that we live in? And how should policymakers and businesses prepare to address these issues?
I think when it comes to climate change, the main worry that I would have personally for deglobalization is the flow of technology itself, because a lot of the technology until today is concentrated within the developed world, and therefore seeing it move to the developing world, which has a lot of good characteristics for renewable energy, for example, whether it is solar panels or solar energy or wind energy, is something that is worrying me today. However, I would say that when it comes to deglobalization, I hope that this is one issue where you do not see the trend taking place, because at the end of the day, there is the Paris Climate Accords, and there is a global commitment to lower carbon emissions by 2030, if I recall correctly. And if at the end of the day, the world starts decoupling on that front, we all breathe the same air, right? So I'm not sure that if you decouple and try to be protectionist on that front, it is going to help you at all. It's going to help anyone at all.
Right. Capital chases after opportunities, as Gucho said. But nowadays, a lot of the world, as we said, is deconstructed, affected by all kinds of divisions. And Eric, you're here for a reason. The reason you're here is to impart on us your experience as a member of the House dealing with bipartisan politics, or rather partisan politics. So when you were in the House, working in the Speaker's office as a whip, those were probably kinder and gentler days by today's standard.
So, well, first of all, I mean, I think, I spent almost 25 years in politics, so before I'm now on Wall Street at Moelis. So I do think that, the way our governments work, does impact the flow of capital for sure. And certainly in those days when I became whip and then leader in the Congress, we had a much different approach to the private sector. And in fact, it was, from my view, the job of government to create the conditions for the growth in capital formation and growth in jobs and wealth. And what we've seen lately, and it's part of sort of, I think, what the world has experienced over the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, obviously we had, these political shocks, one of which was a health shock in the pandemic, and the resulting economic shock, which brought the most powerful central banks in the world to the rescue, causing a monetary shift that we're still feeling the effects of. And I think a realization that this interconnected world that we live in has produced a priority of allowing capital to flow to its most efficient use, which means supply chains that are very dependent upon countries that all of a sudden don't necessarily seem to be in another country's interest. And I know the reaction in Washington has been to put in place massive industrial policy in America, something that I really had not seen during the Bush and Obama years, the way that what we've seen now is U.S. taking industrial policy to try and affect the flow of capital. And obviously the most prominent piece of that industrial policy is what's known as the IRA. I don't call it the Inflation Reduction Act because I'm not sure how you spend $1 trillion from Congress and expect to control inflation. But nonetheless, that has created a lot of draw for capital in the area of climate change, trying to accelerate, if you will, the energy conversion. And we'll see how it all works out, because as you know, in our country, in these free elections that we have every 2 years in Congress, you may see a real shift coming up. We've got national elections every 4 years, and that 24 is one of those. So we'll see. But currently, you know, Congress, government, et cetera, very focused on trying to affect the flow of capital to meet the challenge of what the world has now decided to put these zero carbon or net zero carbon goals out there that frankly are not wholly supported in the US.
Okay, I'm not going to let you go that easily. Afterwards, I'll come back and talk about partisan politics. But let's give the lady a chance. Geopolitics is now affecting capital flow. Concerns about whether some countries are off limits, investable, is affecting in very real terms, very real ways, the way capital goes. How do you, for example, as a financial services institution, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's not forget that geopolitics has influenced capital flows for millennia. I mean, colonialization is a form of geopolitics influencing capital flows. So this is not a new thing. But I think what we are feeling that feels different to us that have been around more like, let's call it 100 years, is that for many decades there was a one-way trade here. There was the view that by outsourcing capabilities to environments or countries that had better labor dynamics, that was a way to bring costs down. To the degree that there were places you could source certain critical raw materials and have alliances, that was really a positive. So globalization was the name of the game, literally in the post-World War II era. And now we're in the deglobalization era, and by virtually any measure that you look at global trade flows, that deglobalization is coming to play. But I think it's important to keep in mind, and Eric sort of went there could be positives and there could be negatives, and there could be just things that it's not clear whether they're positive or negative, but they're clearly uncertainties. So the fact that the US now has the IRA and the CHIPS Act, that's a way that governments get involved that actually spawns innovation and growth. Now, who's able to take advantage of that? Sometimes it's the onshore companies, but it's also companies that are, have their headquarters abroad that can take advantage of that. So that's a benevolent force that can be exerted. Alternatively, we saw some of the tariff issues between the US and China. Suddenly, that was a shock to the system in financial markets. It was a shock to the system in goods markets. Capital flow changed because of what was going on there. And then I think COVID really underscored the need for a certain amount of resiliency, which in a way played to the deglobalization theme, but was actually quite rational. Like, why wouldn't you have multiple supply chains available to you to make sure that you could be resilient in the face of a global pandemic? So companies are having to deal with that. But I would say the most important thing is that what's troubling about today's environment is that it's not clear how stable it is in any regard. So I was talking to a number of companies over the past many weeks, and the biggest thing that they point to is just most capital projects right now require you to have a long-term mindset. You're going to make massive investments over the next couple of years. You want 8, 10, 12, 20-year payoffs from those investments. But if you can't even predict what the political environment is going to be like in 2 years or 6 months or 9 months, how can you possibly project out into a future of multi-decades? So I think what it's going to do is it's going to increasingly force capital allocators to think in terms of shorter term payoff horizon periods, and we all know that that can lead to very suboptimal decision making.
Right. Patrick, you invest a lot in China. You have the wisdom and vision to recognize a lot of the unicorns, especially the technology unicorns in China. What drove you? Are those short-term imperatives that Laurie talked about, do they factor?
Yeah, and can you hear me?
Yep.
So I think the world is overlaid with multiple cycles. There's a capital market cycle, there's a political cycle, and there's also a cycle where we see the efficiency gains has reached its ceiling. And I think for the last 30 years, as you actually credibly pointed out, for somebody's career like ours, for the last 20, 30 years, it's been a beautiful ride because the world has been enjoying peace and prosperity. But also has accumulated a lot of imbalances. For example, housing price in China has gone up to a point nobody can afford, right? And so I think we're entering a period, a lot of things needs to be digested, and so this is a period of correction. But it also happens coincide with this, we have a challenge that is COVID. Effectively, I think COVID did one thing to all of us, stopped us from traveling to see each other, to communicate, to exchange, to figure out how we actually can come up with a solution. And right now we're entering in a world, everything is so expensive. There's expensive because, and inflation. And we're trying to move to the energy transition, and so far it's been costly. But also demographics, that's the next thing. Is for the next 10 years, it's going to pan out. And many, many countries, if you look at the government's physical conditions, are pretty poor to cope with something like this. And lastly, I think the social cost, the political cost somehow has been rising. So we are actually in a rising cost environment from a multiple directions. What is the solution to this? I think the solution is how can you continue to improve efficiency gain? That's the key. I think everything coming back to innovation. And can we have a better tools, better ways of getting everybody organized? And we come up with these amazing companies like what Tesla, Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent has been doing for the world, offering a new tool for us to work more efficiently. And so this is the area I want to say, and most of people talk about China in a way because sometimes people talk about a term and they don't know what they're talking about. And let's focus on the Chinese private companies. If we take a business as a sport, and 30 years ago, if there is Olympics for businesses, China couldn't send anybody to compete in the global Olympics for businesses. 30 years later, they could send a team to compete and probably get a medal. And this guy or this team is private. Is owned and run by a private entrepreneur.
Let's be very clear. You do not invest in state-owned companies. Is that correct?
I like entrepreneurs.
Right.
And I think I can tell the difference. I can select the good ones and back them because they're people. And just like in America, there are some great entrepreneurial businesses. Here in the Middle East, there are great entrepreneurs. And also in China, there are great entrepreneurs. And so far, the entrepreneurs are not able to talk to each other, to find a way of working together, addressing the key challenges for the world. I think this is where making things a bit costly. So that's why I say, a lot of things, for example, I know Eric really well, I know Gucho really well. They continue to talk to a larger audience and encourage the entrepreneurs to come to take the center stage, to innovate, right? And I think and a lot of things you stand for in America to support businesses. I think that's what we need.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, the US-China relationship is probably one of the most consequential, important relationships of our lifetimes. How it pans out, whether it improves, whether it deteriorates, will have tremendous impact on how we do businesses, how policies are made. So I want to ask Eric and Laurie, to what extent is this a function of US domestic politics? Oftentimes, every few months, we see politicians jump up, play to the gallery, and come up with policies one way or the other. whether they be sanctions or whatever, and they have global ramifications. You mentioned the CHIPS Act is one of them, and there were numerous other acts that were executed during the previous administration. So to what extent, how do we overcome this? How does the rest of the world overcome what is essentially a US domestic problem?
Well, maybe I'll start. I guess the first thing I would say is that it takes two to tango, and both of those superpowers want to be the dominant superpower in the world. So there are pressures on both sides to move from what was really a co-opetition kind of mindset to more of a strategic rivalry kind of mindset. There are a couple of major implications. First and foremost is it does make a situation where others have to choose sides, right? So to the degree that there's not the ability to sort of share, that creates this kind of more global division. So you're already seeing that, right, in sort of regional alliances that are fracturing because of the nature of the rivalry that you have between the US and China. So that's not good. The other thing is that it means that you don't get this collaboration between very smart people who can actually do a 1 + 1 = 3, and instead you have disparate efforts. Think about the COVID vaccination development, for example. Again, without opining on which of those two did a better job. I have a view on that, obviously, but that's not the point. The point is that you had different groups pursuing different strategies instead of coming together to find a kind of global solution. So I think it can be damaging for both of those reasons, but sure you have some ideas there too.
Well, first of all, I go back to what Patrick said about we need to start to normalize relations in the private sector, and right now it's very difficult, as you suggest, because of government policy, and I do think because we are truly a representative democracy in the US, it is driven by a sense across the populace, but the business community as well, is caused, our government, whether it's the legislative branch or in the White House, to take a position that's strongly in opposition to some of the things that have come down from Beijing. And if we look at sort of the roots of all this, it really, you can trace it back to before 2000 when, our Congress voted to allow for the admittance of admittance of China into the WTO.
Are you saying that's a bad thing?
Excuse me?
Are you saying that's a bad thing?
Well, it was a good thing, but what happened was there was an underlying belief that if that were to take place, that then China would begin to really conduct its affairs in itself in accord with what I think most of us in the West at least, and certainly in other places, are used to, which is the international norms and the rule of law. And there is a strong sense in the US that if that didn't happen, then China wouldn't succeed. Well, guess what? As Laurie said, here we see China on the rise, and there's a real view now that China's gotten there because it somehow avoided some of those rules that the rest of us, including the US, try and support. So I think that is and that is the blame, that is the root of the blame that is attached to a lot of the anti-China sentiment that exists today in the US. And then on top of that, when you look at corporate America and its desire to be able to tap into the world's now second largest consumer market, it is, there is increasing sense among the business community that some of the intellectual property, some of the conduct of state-owned enterprises in China aren't giving the US competition a fair shake. And so if we saw with President Trump, he was the first one to step up and say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do this. And he basically started a trade war with China. And so that's where we are today. How we get out of it, I do believe Patrick's onto something. If we could somehow start with the grassroots, with entrepreneurs, with individuals who really can identify with one another and think about how we can sort of take the temperature down a little bit, because obviously it's become very politically attractive in both countries to man a strong opposition.
But is the evidence true, though? Right? You said several things you've said. One is China has gamed the WTO system. The U.S., as far as I know, is the recipient of more WTO complaints than a lot of other countries, including China. So, which means that the U.S. probably breaches WTO rules more than other countries. In terms of U.S. companies having access to the China market, Apple counts China as one of its biggest profit centers. GM, as far as I remember, in the past used to make 25% of their profit out of China alone. So by the same token, Chinese phone companies are not sold in the US, such as Huawei. Chinese car makers can't get into the US. So to what extent is that a problem of perception? And to what extent is that problem a reality?
Listen, when you're dealing with politics, perception becomes reality.
Okay.
Right? So this is, if you want to do something about it, we could sit here and argue the merits of one's position on either side. But if you want to try and do something about it, you got to deal with that perception.
Okay.
And that's sort of where I think the sentiment that Patrick expressed could work.
Let's move to the next, to an attempt to address this perception. So we are now towards the end of October. In a few weeks' time, the leaders of APEC will be meeting in San Francisco. From all indications, from all signs, there seem to be that there is a good chance that Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping may be able to meet, and certainly they seem to be willing to meet. If they do meet, what does that mean? If they don't meet, what does that mean? Shall we go around the panel and and also if they do meet, what would you like them to say to each other? I'm going to start with Patrick. Can you put your mic a little bit closer? Yeah.
Can
Please.
you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Again, in the real world, I think you probably have seen the statistics. The flights between U.S. and China, and prior to COVID, there was 300 flights a week. Now it's 20 flights a week. And it's moving up to 40 flights a week. People don't meet, people don't talk. And I think for them to meet, I think is a great gesture. Although it's symbolic, but I think it really takes some temperature down. I think that's very, very important. And secondly, what's interesting about the business community and the political community, sometimes people read the cycles a little bit different. And I think for technology cycles, and I think we really needed to count on, not necessarily technology, but the innovation cross-board to really help us and to deal with this increasingly costly environment. And people need to work together. I think as long as they push in that direction, I think it's going to be helpful.
What if they don't meet?
What they don't meet, and I think they will meet. I mean, it's just, at some point, and I think it's negotiation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Laurie, if they do meet, what
well,
like
start with if they don't meet. If they don't meet, it sends the signal that they don't care about each other. And they care about each other deeply. So I'm in the camp, I hope they do meet. If they do meet, so I'll go back to the session this morning. I think it was Jane Fraser said there's a new S in ESG. It's called security. So I think if they do meet, it would be great if they could set the stage for a common understanding that they need to tackle together environment, security, and governance at least. Social is a little trickier because social has all kinds of connotations, so I'll leave that S aside for a moment. But giving the world a view that they recognize that there are issues that have to be grappled with, whether it is rule of law and the way that various government entities behave on the global stage, whether it's the security dimensions, like obviously having them be rivals in that regard is not good for anybody, and then obviously environment is one of the great challenges of our era, right? So how they're going to collaborate on environmental related elements. And I think there is a path forward on all three of these through the lens of innovation and people coming together and all that sort of thing.
Eric, now you're the seasoned politician, right? Bearing in mind the optics of a president seeking re-election, meeting with a big poobah from the strategic rival, what would you like them to say to each other?
So what I would like to see, I mean, along the lines, I think what Laurie was saying is to try and outline maybe 3 to 5 areas where we could improve, okay? And you've just set the agenda, if you will, for a dialogue that should start in earnest. And a lot of the travel back and forth with some of our cabinet secretaries to Beijing has already sort of started the discussion that there are going to be working groups at the agency level in Washington with their counterparts in Beijing. But I do think that beginning to build that narrative, that there will be a dialogue, because I do think the issue of security, because that's what the I don't want to say animus, but there is a real sense of disturbance among most of the American public about the direction that the Chinese are taking, the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi. So how do we change that narrative? Because right now it's bleeding over in big time into the military arena, the maritime arena. We just saw an incident in the Philippines in the last couple days. Of course, in the technological areas where we have sensitive technologies, where the Biden administration has taken steps to say, we are going to ban investment outbound from the U.S., which again is something that is so anathema to what I have known as the U.S. about freedom to allocate your capital. All of these areas need attention, but I think prioritizing them, beginning in earnest, people on both capitals to begin to advocate for a better way with all of this.
Right. Karim, sitting where you are, do you care?
Absolutely, because you have no idea how the Chinese-US relationships do play a part in this world today. It is no secret the Arab world is taking certain sides, right? And I don't think anybody wants that. I think we also see issues when it comes, for example, to developments on AI, which both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are making huge strides in. You're seeing issues when it comes to importing expertise from certain countries versus importing chips, for example, that are made by NVIDIA, and so on and so forth. So it does have an impact on how the Arab world also does develop going forward. It also has an impact during the pandemic, for example, regarding which vaccine that should be chosen and so on. So all this lack of cooperation between the two superpowers in the world today does put the Arab world in a situation where a place that wants to innovate and grow is curtailed by certain geopolitical issues.
Mm-hmm. So the stakes are high.
Sorry?
The stakes are high.
Absolutely.
Right. Your capital,
the Arab world, it has definitely increased as companies came to the market. More free float is available for investors. We just had an IPO here in Saudi Arabia where we had massive foreign investor participation from the US, Europe. So if the opportunity is there, regardless of where that opportunity springs from, I think you will continue to find capital coming from Asia, the US, or Europe. It won't make a difference.
I think capital chases innovation. Innovation needs capital, and I think you look at what's going on in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it is about innovation. That's why all of us are here. This sort of vision, positive vision for the future, that attracts capital. And to your question of is it easier or not, it is a very complicated world right now. That is for sure. I think all of us sort of agree on that. And so we mentioned where there are impediments that they're put in place by protectionism, tariffs, and others. So I do think the investor has to be, sort of certainly aware of that, but you are not going to beat the allure of innovation. And I know and certainly in our country, in my country, there is a strong emphasis on our universities and centers of academic excellence to continue to provide the seed capital so that innovation flourishes so we can tackle some of these very difficult issues before us.
Laurie, what do you think?
So as a free market capitalist, anything that deconstructs the world is a friction, and that's bad, right? So whether it's the government sector, whether it's preferences of consumers, pick your thing, it's uniformly bad. So what does it mean? Well, it means everything's more expensive, right? So it's inflation creating. It means that you have bigger winners and losers. It means that even if you win, you probably don't win as big as you would have won otherwise. So I agree with the sentiment that capital will still chase innovation and opportunity, and there will still be innovation and opportunity, but the risk level will be much higher, the return bar will be much higher, and the capital invested will be lower in the aggregate.
Right. Patrick, what do you think?
I talk to entrepreneurs and investors around the world. When you speak to the entrepreneurs in Europe, they said, there's no money in Europe. There's money in China. There's money in the US.
Money,
when you talk to
money.
Yeah, when you talk to entrepreneurs in China, they said, there's not much in China. Maybe there's a lot in the US. But when you talk to the US entrepreneurs, they said, other than AI, you just cannot raise money in America today. So there is lack of risk capital in the world because a lot of money is in the savings account. And today, the 10-year yield has gone up to more than 5%. People earn money by having the money sitting in the savings account. What is the difference between money and the capital? Capital serves a purpose. There's a velocity, and that creates value as a result. So the challenge for the world today is, with so much inflation and forcing everybody to pay a really high yield for any kind of a debt instrument, and the risk capital has become much smaller as a pool. This is a fundamental challenge, not for one country, not for one sector, it's for everybody. So in order to address that, bring the cost down, I hope, people can figure out to work together. And I think globalization thing, essentially, it's not just trying to go globalize or deglobalize. Why go globalize? Because it helps
Right.
and reduce the cost and make every innovation less costly, and then people can back it. People are backing innovations. Eventually, they want to make money. They're not backing innovation just to say for the purpose of doing that. Unfortunately, this is a problem. Although we have a generation so talented entrepreneurs today, they cannot raise capital. And that's where the problem is.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So thank you, dear panelists, for bearing with me and staying with us. And if you do feel like interacting with our panel members, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to exchange name cards and take your questions. Thank you very much for being a great audience. Thank you.